Hi, everybody. I'm Stevie. Like Michael said, I'm an assistant professor. I'm a newer professor at University of Minnesota, so it's A, great to be here, and B, great to be in a place where I don't have to wear a puffer that goes down to my knees to walk between buildings. And so today I'm going to talk to you about the work that I do in human-centered AI for mental health prediction on social media. Before I get started, though, I do have to warn you and the audience that because of the work I do on mental health, I'm going to be talking about subjects related to mental health with some examples in this presentation. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about and discussing examples in the most general cases related to suicide as well as to eating disorders. There is one example towards the end of the talk that is a specific tweet of somebody who is thinking about ending their own life. If you need to go take a walk or not pay attention during that portion of the talk, I totally understand. I don't know the difference between you need to take a bathroom break and you needing to just take a walk for your own well-being. I encourage it if that's something that's important to you. So let's go ahead and get started. At this point of my career, most of us are aware that there is a mental health crisis in the United States. About 1 in 5 people in the US in 2021 reported experiencing mental illness, and that would be what we consider like a clinically relevant level of distress and disorder. And then in that same time period, 1 in 20 in the US experienced severe mental illness, something that therapists and clinicians and psychiatrists would really want to intervene in, something that's dramatically affecting people's lives and well-being. And of those people, nearly 50,000 people in the US die by suicide every year. This number is way up from historical averages. This has gone up noticeably since 2010, but that may seem big or small to you, just kind of depending on the context of which you understand mental health. But one of the most troubling parts about this is about 12 million adults seriously think about suicide every year. And those are the kind of people that many times our clinical as well as sort of therapeutic interventions cannot reach because they are suffering in silence. So people go online to try and communicate about their well-being, to talk to others, but also to reach out to trusted family and friends to try and get information about mental health and to help them just feel better. So I've been studying this work since about the work on mental health since about 2014. 2018, 2019, social media companies started rolling out AI systems that would allow them to detect when people were talking about what I call severe or dangerous mental illness. This is when someone's talking about things that involve physical or bodily harm, like suicidal thoughts or self-injury. And part of the motivation behind this is for interventions for content moderation. But other platforms like Facebook, in this case, actually were trying to use it for prevention efforts. So in 2018, Facebook deploys this algorithm behind the scenes that helps them identify when somebody may be thinking about ending their own life. They say it's run at the time by a random forest model based on text patterns in data. If you're familiar with this, this is actually a pretty lightweight, easy, straightforward model. And they say that this model was able to get about 10 people every day that weren't already reported by friends and family on the platform for an intervention. And Facebook says that they use this model to help identify when an intervention might be necessary, such as sending people information about hotlines or trusted support or connecting them with resources to help them work through whatever they're going through. And it's not just Facebook that has these models. On the back end, Google, X/Twitter, Reddit, a lot of companies actually have these kind of models both for content moderation reasons as well as being supportive of people who are in distress. And so I think that these models and this deployment ask some really interesting questions about building AI to detect this. And so I like to think about this in terms of the consequences of what happens when we make a bad system to predict suicidal ideation or some other kind of mental illness. And the challenge here is building bad systems in this case have technical consequences, right? It's bad models. We just get bad scientific standards. Our performance kind of stinks. We don't represent the concepts that we want to, and so we don't actually intervene in the appropriate situation because we've gotten the answer wrong. And I think that there's a lot of risks here about what might happen if you have a poor model that predicts suicidal ideation or depression or any number of mental illnesses. But Oh, and then one of the things I wanted to mention is that a lot of my past work actually worked on building better models for this. So during my PhD, I spent a lot of time trying to engineer ways that you can infer that somebody might actually be suffering from elevated levels of distress, and then thinking about the consequences of building that. So this is two systems that I worked on from my PhD. One of these is a multimodal representation of Tumblr data, where we were able to take in the image as well as the text data that came along with this, and then be able to predict whether or not it was severe enough that something might be taken down or require an intervention. Another one we built was assessing people's mental illness severity in the more general case on Instagram, using a data set of about 25 million posts. And this figure shows the rates of severe content on Instagram increasing over time based on our model. And so one of the things that was really interesting to me during my PhD is actually proving you could solve these kind of technical problems, right? We can build some models that deal with these problems. But as I moved forward in my PhD and got closer to graduation, one of the things that started really worrying me were the outcomes of when we solve these problems of poor models and making them better, and then actually deploying them in the real world. So this is just like two articles that have come up in the last year about the use of generative AI in mental health applications. The top is when Coco, which is a chatbot, started generating responses to people using ChatGPT and not telling them. Normally, Coco is done by volunteers who directly counsel with you and talk to you. And people got really upset that 4,000 people were being helped by ChatGPT and nobody told them, even if they thought that the care was actually pretty good. And then we also have this challenge that AI models that are built on large data sets that move beyond just social networks across the whole web are actually imitating these dangerous behaviors and can be forced in many ways to come up with these kinds of ideas. And so in these cases, I get really curious about, okay, so we can build good models. What are the kinds of things we might expect them to do, and how might they behave in the wild? And I think one of the challenges with these two is that these are a little speculative, right? These are tiny, small examples of when ChatGPT and other large language models running independently may have negative consequences. But these consequences aren't just speculative, tech imagining with the fun of ChatGPT. This is actually an example of a negative consequence coming out of Amazon's recommender system. So this is two substances that when you take them together, you will die. And this is basically, and I do not mean this in any way to be crass, this is a literal click-to-buy suicide cocktail that was being propagated through its systems because there was a group online that was going to Amazon and encouraging people to purchase this pair of substances. Amazon sees people continuously buying this. It says, hey, this is a good recommendation to make to you. If you buy substance A, you probably want substance B too. And this was up on Amazon for 6 months and got reported on by, I think, the New York Times twice before it was actually taken down. And so these are the kinds of questions I also wonder about the consequences of good systems, right? When we have stuff that actually works, how are we actually going to handle the fact that ChatGPT may behave in ways that are damaging to people's well-being? Or when ChatGPT replaces people in therapy, what do we do? And so all these interesting ethical questions come up in this work that are really important to me as a computer scientist to both acknowledge, start thinking about because I have the technical capacity to do so, and to try and solve. And so this leads to sort of the big question. You might not be surprised. One of the things I'm really interested in how you build and evaluate AI systems for mental health that are actually rigorous and solve the problem we claim that they solve, but are also ethical and think about people's well-being and their preferences about how these systems operate in the wild. So I'm going to show you today about how my research kind of contributes to a holistic vision of human-computer AI, or human-centered AI, to solve problems. And the domain that I focus on is in mental health and social media. But many of these tools and techniques and insights extend beyond just the case of social media and mental health, given their focus on sort of socially contentious, sensitive issues. You can imagine a lot of these same questions about appropriateness of tools, good tools being deployed in practice. These come up in areas like mis and disinformation, political polarization, toxicity detection, and prevention of harassment in online communities. And sort of the informal vision of my research that I like to talk about when I'm not giving a very formal talk is how can I serve humanity and make people's lives better while also making some really cool and impactful tech too. And this is sort of a combination of both my interest personally in making sure the tech that I build actually is successful and empathetic and ethical, but also from my disciplinary background. I have an undergrad in media studies and comm, and my graduate degrees are in computer science. And I feel really impassioned to combine these two together in human-computer interaction and AI research such that we can actually do both at the same time. And my goal with this talk is to persuade you can actually do both as something like a research career that you might be interested in. Quick plug for my group. They're the ones who are doing a lot of this work for me at this point. We are part of Group Lens at UMN. As Michael explained, we are an old HCI group that's been around since like the early 90s. I was not out of elementary school by that point. They've been doing groundbreaking research on recommender systems, peer production, and social media since the mid to mid-90s. These are my fantastic PhD students who helped me do all of this work. And they're really interested in all aspects of human-centered AI for mental health as well as other stigmatized identities. Some of them are core AI researchers like Nuruddin, who's at the top left. He's really interested in building AI tech that works outside of the global north, versus some of my other students do interview work and work on social science theory and think more about the HCI ethics side of these problems. And I like to give them a little shout here because they're the ones who are doing this work with me now and are some of the brains behind my operation. So you'll see their photos pop up when they're the ones who are kind of leading the projects that I'm going to talk about. So that's an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to deep dive into this idea about data set quality error and improving validity in this conversation because I think it's an important issue that's sort of emerged in the last 5 years. And people really aren't sort of addressing it in the way that I'm like kind of personally satisfied about. I'm going to walk you through kind of several projects that kind of have like queued up the empirical technical work that I'm doing, which is sort of an analytical deep dive into the practices of the field, empirically showing that my analytical argument was actually true, and then the technical kind of brainstorming that I've been doing about how to solve these problems. Also talk about some work we're doing in building and deploying interventions to help people's mental health be better, and then I'm going to wrap up with social outcomes of HCI systems. One thing I'll just mention, I'm totally happy to take questions for clarification, but this talk typically generates some really spicy and interesting ethical questions and things that are like a little bit bigger that can be answered in like 30 to 45 seconds. And so if you have those questions, please write them down. We can totally come back to the end. This talk's only going to take me about another 30, 35 minutes. So we'll have plenty of time for Q&A later. All right. So today I'm going to talk a lot about data set quality, error, and improving validity. How many of y'all have ever taken an intro to psych or psychology classes? Some experience in psych. Okay, this is actually better than most of the time when I ask this in a computer science audience. Y'all might be familiar with this concept of validity, or the idea that the thing that you're trying to measure actually aligns with the concept that you have in your head about it. This is really crucial in psychology when we start to use this to measure hard to define concepts like social support, personality, and in clinical psychology, defining this idea of and measuring concepts like depression and anxiety. Now, towards the end of my PhD, after I was building all these systems, I was like, yeah, we can totally predict these dangerous things from mental health. I had this kind of moment of like, wait, am I actually doing the thing that I said that I'm doing with this work? And I wanted to go back and reflect on practices that not only I was engaging in, but that I was also replicating from prior work that was receiving hundreds of citations and driving the development of these systems from places like Facebook and Google behind the scenes. So towards the end of my PhD, I got really interested in how practice affects these decisions in the papers that I was reading. So I conducted this gigantic systematic literature review of research that predicted mental health via social media data. Now, this is an ongoing project that my lab maintains. We started out with, I think, 55 or 60 papers. That was in 2018 or 2019. We got up to 75 papers in 2020 and 129 papers in 2022. And so this area is rapidly growing. It's very intriguing. And it's also a very interesting interdisciplinary area where researchers in machine learning, AI, natural language processing, HCI, and health informatics, which is a huge spread of work, actually start to contribute to this work. And so it was really difficult to actually I don't want to underscore that, oh, this is a systematic lit review where I just basically read a lot of papers. Getting this in a way that actually maps to the idea of what I had took a lot of time. I'm really happy to talk to you about systematic lit reviews in Q&A if that's something that you're interested in. But I'm just going to skim the sort of methodology of this for the sake of this talk. So as I mentioned earlier, validity is a really important concept when you're dealing with these kind of fuzzy, difficult to measure concepts. So in this particular data set, we wanted to look at construct validity, which is a specific form of measurement. This is basically making inferences from the sampling particulars of a study to the higher order constructs of what they represent. Okay, that's like the textbook definition from one of the famous textbooks about measurement. Let's talk about what that means. In your head, you have an idea of a concept you want to measure. Let's say it's depression. How are you going to actually know that a person you're screening in person has depression? Everybody, we probably need some kind of agreed on ideas or notions or variables that might affect depression. And we want to make sure that those are rigorous. Construct validity focuses on that first task, that the ideas that you have in your head actually can map in some way to the real world, and those real world ideas can map back to the ideas that everybody kind of holds about this definition of depression they have in their head. Now, for my case, what that means is if we're trying to use social media to measure depression, does the social media data actually represent depression? Or does it represent another concept? And you might ask, how do you measure that? Now, the way that we typically do this in social media data is with proxies. Proxies are an alternative means by measuring a concept when you can't actually ask a person directly whether or not they're experiencing the thing that they're experiencing. Traditionally, you would ask someone in a clinical interview, hey, have you been feeling down and blue for the last 2 weeks? Have you had a lack of emotions? Are you really angry? These kind of screening questions you or a loved one may have experienced when you go to the doctor and they're talking to you about your mental health. We can't do that with social media users very easily. And even in studies where we can, it gets prohibitively expensive to get a large enough data set to build a machine learning model based on that data. So we use proxies instead. And so one of the things the systematic literature review found was the kinds of and varieties of proxies that people said mapped to concepts in mental health. So they would use things like computer scientists who would go in and say, does this person seem like they're depressed? Yes or no, or maybe. They would use community or network affiliations, like participating in a Reddit subreddit about anxiety to say that that person would have anxiety, or by using hashtags related to certain behaviors or disorders. They also would look at things like personal self-disclosures of diagnosis, administering screeners and questions to people if they had the time and resources to, keyword matching. This leaves me with the question, though, okay, you have these concepts that you say that you are using to measure mental health. Do they actually represent mental health? And I'm sure you're starting to stew in your mind of like, oh, does everybody who posts to r/depression, are they actually all depressed? Now, there's a lot of reasons to believe that those people are having valid symptoms that are distressing them, right? We believe that these people, when they're posting for help, are actually distressed. But if you care about predicting the outcome, which is depression specifically, they may not all map to that narrow construct of diagnosis. They may actually, in fact, have some kinds of anxiety, bipolar disorder, which manifests as depression for some people over short periods of time before they enter manic episodes. They might also have just other conditions that are not related to depression. They may be asking on behalf of a loved one, right? It's hard to know from some of these sources whether or not they actually generalize. And so we were like, well, do people even address this in their arguments? Now, I've talked to you about the depression example, but the one that I think is actually most salient and concerning to me is anxiety. I personally have anxiety, and it's something that I have to manage through therapeutic processes. But when I was looking at papers that were talking about predicting anxiety, none of them specified what they meant when they said anxiety, which as somebody who's has a clinical disorder of this was like, wait. You don't even tell me how you predict this? You're not telling me how you set this up? Because anxiety can be a symptom that influences both some anxious trends, but also other mental disorders like OCD. It can be a transient emotion that people experience, right? I'm a little more anxious than normal because I'm giving a talk. It can also be lay usage when you have a friend that you might refer to. Oh, man, she's just anxious, don't worry about it, right? Or it can actually be a category of nervous disorders, of which generalized anxiety disorder is one of several different kinds of anxiety disorders. Nobody in these papers mapped the fact that #anxiety could map to any of these 4 definitions. And you can imagine people using hashtags in different circumstances to talk about all 4 of these different examples. And what we found was that nobody actually defined what they meant by anxiety when they measured it from the data. And this was true across the vast majority of studies of mental illness and machine learning. Now, this was in 2019. We've repeated and looked at these results in the future, and we still find similar things. And the challenge here is like if nobody defines what they mean by anxiety and they say they're actually predicting this outcome, it's really hard to know if the system that they've built actually works to predict the thing that they care about. And what we did is in follow-up work, we actually looked at whether or not these kinds of practices were actually happening across more papers. And we looked at like sort of practices related to disclosing data source, the kind of information we need. And what we found is, this is in 2023, Lee actually showed that these practices are becoming more normatively implicit. Basically that when disclosure happens across groups of papers, people in the future will start to do the same kind of disclosures and replicate prior work. Now this is really good. When you have things like IRB disclosures and consent and anonymizing people correctly in data sets to make sure that their data does not leak into other kinds of models. But this actually can be really, really damaging if practices of a lack of disclosure are not getting reported and people believe that not reporting on information is something that's standard in the field. Now, one of the things, so this is kind of good news, right? We have this practice where people are like more and more reporting on different ethical practices. Unfortunately, like the data sourcing and inclusion are being reported more, but unfortunately people still didn't buy the risks of this argument that I was making from the analytical kind of analysis that I did in the systematic lit review. Now, I just want to be clear, these are paraphrased and slightly editorialized comments I found about the findings that I just told you about. But people have sincerely told me these things that may be like, well, it doesn't actually matter if the concept measures the thing that you claim it measures, right? Our performance doesn't lie. We're getting F1 of like 0.91, 0.95 with like accuracy that's like super high. And like some people were like, but LLMs will just like solve this problem, right? If you just shove it into BERT, I literally got this in a paper review. If you just put it into BERT, it would be fine. And then the other one was like, it's the best data that we can get. Give me a break. I'm trying to solve a really hard social problem. I should have the flexibility of possibly that data making these errors. Now, I have feelings about this, unsurprisingly. And this like leads me to this interesting question of whether or not when we use like complex machine learning architectures like LLMs or BERT or other kind of transformers, we actually can erase the problems of the data. And so these arguments were basically running against the classic notion that we teach in like computer science 101, which is garbage in, garbage out, right? That the quality of the data that you put into a system necessarily affects the quality of the inferences and the outcomes that it gives. And this actually, these comments were not just levied in reviews, but also in job talks where people were like, no, it's totally fine. Just like throw an LLM at it, Stevie. It'll be totally fine. So I was like, all right, hold on. I got this. So I actually got really, really annoyed and wanted to prove empirically that this downstream process actually mattered so that people would buy the empirical consequences of this bad data actually affected the models themselves. So what we did is we looked at one of the most popular and sort of clinically gold standard proxy signals, which is diagnostic self-disclosure. This is when people go online and say, I have been diagnosed with a specific disorder. Now, the reason we love this disclosure is because people are almost always honest about it. Mental health is stigmatized, and it can take a lot for people to admit when they go through stigmatizing or shameful experiences. Side note, I don't think that mental health should be stigmatized, but it still is something. And so we look for people when they talk online that says, I was diagnosed with bulimia. And we know that this is a high quality signal. So let me show you how the inference like typically goes in the machine learning process. So we want to be able to find people with eating disorders in the whole world because they're often undertreated, underdiagnosed. Eating disorders are very dangerous when they go unchecked. We then say, okay, we know that we can get people with a diagnosed eating disorder. And then we look at people who disclose eating disorders in social media data. We then can get this data from lots of different sources, including Twitter and Facebook and TikTok, because people will disclose this. And then we get our training data, which is that like shaded area in the middle. And then we can use that training data as info to be able to infer back to at least the blue circle. But our goal is to actually infer back to the whole purple circle. And that we've built a model because we know these people have an eating disorder, we can generalize this back to find other people in purple that aren't in the blue circle. And this is a kind of common setup in these papers where the idea is like, you can't get the data directly, so we use the social media data and then generalize it. And this goes to the problem of what I was mentioning earlier of people being like, oh, the data will just be fine. And me being like, wait, we don't know that this actually measures the purple circle. So this project was an audit to show that you could actually measure the purple circle. So the question that we looked at was, are these gaps caused by the way that the field operationalizes the training data into the models themselves? And do gaps come up in the validity and integrity of those models? Yes. They are very hard to detect, though, because it's easy to cover up their gaps with high technical performance, which gets to the point that that person was criticizing my work from previously of, well, the model performs fine, clearly it's working well. And we do this through an audit that the training data actually has really damaging contextual gaps that compromise the validity of the model. And so let me walk you through how we got this data, how we ran our little audit, and one of the examples of these contextual gaps so that you understand kind of the problems that we get when we sort of do this like training data inference. So as I mentioned, self-disclosure is one of the most common ones, and part of the reason it's so loved is because you can build a regular expression to get it very, very quickly. So we modified and like basically improved on state-of-the-art regular expressions that are used to find this data. For those of you that have never used regex, it's a really, really nice open kind of flexible string matching protocol where you can set up kind of very loose string matches to be able to find people like text matches. So it's really good for finding and identifying repetitive text like phone numbers and emails. And you can leverage it to look up, I was diagnosed with bulimia. And that's exactly what we did. We came up with self-references of saying that it was me who was diagnosed, variants of the way that you could say diagnosed in the English language, and then a list of disorders and slang terms that people use to refer to being diagnosed with those disorders. So ANA and AN is anorexia or anorexia nervosa, so AN. BN and bulimia, OSFED and ED are sort of the general all-encompassing terms for eating disorders. And we were able to do this multi-round refinement on the regular expression with human labeling to make sure that the quality of these the regular expression matches were actually very high quality. So we went and did probably a process of 5 or 6 iterations on this to make sure it was perfect. And then we went through and did a human annotation and got an F1 of about 0.85. Now what's interesting here that I don't report on specifically with a table is typically regular expressions are a high precision activity. Our precision and recall trade-off for this F1 was a lot tighter than the state-of-the-art baselines, which means that we had less false negatives than other people who had implemented this, meaning that we could trust that our regular expression was not pulling in erroneous data when it made these matches. So we looked at the self-disclosures and said, yes, these are all people talking about being diagnosed. We're really, really confident of that. Then what we did is we set up a machine learning experiment to see if these problems that we had in our head about validity actually propagated through these models. So what we did is we took a data set of posts from a Reddit community. I've anonymized it to r/community. It's an eating disorder support subreddit that gives people a neutral space to talk about disorder and doesn't allow for content that would be sort of pro or advocating for disordered eating behaviors. Of the training data, we found 292 users who had a diagnostic disclosure inside this community. More on that number in a second. And to match the field's sort of testing protocols, we found historical data from 292 random users with no diagnostic disclosure. Now, we selected this kind of random baseline from the same community to make the prediction task kind of artificially harder, right? If your goal is to check the validity of the disclosure, you want to test this against the possibly closest community of negative results, which would be people talking in an eating disorder community that have never said that they have an eating disorder. And then the reason that we want this is because then we have high confidence that a model that can make these distinguishing characteristics is actually honing in on people we have high confidence have a diagnosis, which is that clinical certitude we want to replicate in the model. Now, we pre-process this by removing the regular expression word matches from our regular expression that I showed you before. We do this to basically like avoid cheating the model by saying, oh, if you mention the word diagnosis, it should automatically be classified into the positive. Or the positive class, right? And we do this partially to get at those more latent signals of what it's like to be diagnosed with an eating disorder, of people talking about that experience. We treat the model details as well as the like classical statistical model as a hyperparameter, and we select models that have interpretable features. So like binary logistic regression, SVMs with like I'm totally blanking on the kernel name, but it's the kernel that actually produces like interpretable features out of it, as well as random forest, because we can actually intuit the features. Yeah.
There's a couple of details I'm sharing with you. Is it predicting off of all posts from a single
Yes, it's predicting off of a historical post before the point that they mentioned that they've had a diagnosis. Everything before. And that's the idea there is most setups in this space will use historical data of emerging symptoms or behaviors or cognitions that might indicate that somebody is leading into being diagnosed.
And then how do you match the before for someone negative?
We try and get a time-based match. So we find somebody at that, we look in their whole post data set to make sure they don't find a disclosure, and we try and time match it approximately. So we have approximately the same volume of post.
And so the other question is, given the membership in that community, conditioned on the membership of the community, negative data doesn't mean negative diagnosis.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
But the goal is to be able to build a clinically specific classifier where you have high confidence that the positive data is actual clinical certitude. And so these kinds of setups, you're kind of poking at some of the intellectual challenges with these setups. The goal is to artificially make the task harder, because like an easier task would be like taking the negative data set of like 300 people from like all of Reddit that have never talked about an eating disorder.
Right. So just to make sure I'm with you, the negative data could be people who were diagnosed with eating disorder but just haven't disclosed it. So this is predicting whether they will later disclose, not necessarily whether they have eating disorder.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and so it's an interesting, the setup here is replicating the state-of-the-art kind of way that we set this data up. I agree with you about the limitation, like the kind of implicit limitations that might be in a setup like that. And that's part of the reason that like the critique that I'm about to make actually pops up because of these problems. Okay, so...
Just one very quick question.
Yes.
It says anonymized eating disorder support. What does anonymized mean here? Because if it's anonymized, how do you know their previous posts?
Oh, so when I say anonymized, the community that we study actually requests to not be identified in papers. They actually have it very clearly in their rules that they'll let you do research, but they don't want to be mentioned by name. The other content we anonymize by removing people's usernames and any identifying data in the post where they may mention other subreddits or other people, so that their like personal like usernames don't go into the data. But when I say anonymized, I mean I'm not going to tell you what the subreddit is. Sure. So we ended up also testing this with five-fold cross-fold validation. Just to make sure that our results were consistent given the size of our data set, right? 292 users is not a lot of data, and you might expect a lot of variance just depending on how those users might be sampled. So what we ended up finding was that a regularized binary logistic regression ironically kind of worked the best to be able to differentiate between these two classes of people in this community. We were able to get an F1 of like 0.91 and a balanced precision recall and area under the curve. Basically, we kind of matched state of the art in being able to predict and differentiate between these two groups of people. And to Michael's point, it's actually pretty impressive that we can differentiate so much between people who are diagnosed and say that they're diagnosed, but are existing in the same community as the people in the negative data set, which are also talking about eating disorder symptoms and things. But the challenge when you set up the positive data set like this actually comes out when we start to walk through issues with these contextual errors that we found in the classifier. One of them is this idea of temporality. So I gave you this example earlier of I was diagnosed with bulimia several months ago. That means we can use the data from behind this disclosure, the first one that they make, and say, okay, this is like information up until the point where they disclose that they have a diagnosis, right? Well, no. This person points out that if I think I were to get diagnosed again, I'd say I have binge eating disorder. So this actually leads to a really interesting question. So when we looked at the blue in our regular expression check, this is a diagnostic disclosure. This person clearly at some point has bulimia. Now they're just not sure. And it's been several months between those points. It's a really interesting question, though, of what disorder should we put them in a category of? Is classifying across all eating disorders good enough for this work? Or do we need to now separate into bulimia and anorexia nervosa and binge eating disorder and specificity and disambiguate this specific example? In the worst case, though, we found that our diagnostic disclosure signals worked really, really well, but now are not actually temporally relevant at all for our data, right? This person says that I was diagnosed with anorexia when I was 16. Now I'm 28. Now there's been 12 years of data that we could, in theory, use going backwards. But the problem is we don't even know if that 12 years of data is actually relevant anymore. This person may be in recovery. And by classifying them into the like disordered category, the last 12 years of data may actually just be wrong. And you may be thinking, oh, well, what if you just like did some like evaluation of the time of when they said this, right? You could like go through this and find several months ago, and I'm 16, now I'm 28, and like discount these examples. Remember, we only have 292 examples. And this is actually like a really, really big problem when you start imposing more additional quality signatures on this tiny little data set. And this is 292 examples of 70,000 users in this data, which raises really important questions about the representativeness of people who disclose in an eating disorder forum, if they have an eating disorder, but then also imposes this kind of like pressure on people building models when you like, okay, we want to do the time sensitivity analysis that I just mentioned. Now our data set's going to have 30 people, 20. And we started to do this analysis and realized like you'd end up with like maybe 10 to 15 examples of somebody that in that moment had received a diagnosis and was trying to work through what was going on. And so these problems of temporality in our data set just like completely blow out and cause this like error that's really, really hard to catch if you just looked at the performance of the performance of the model. And what's interesting is we actually found that the time words appear as crucial information for predicting whether or not somebody actually had a diagnosis. What we realized is that people would often talk about and give narratives of diagnosis as an important part of their eating disorder journeys that might involve the diagnosis changing or them moving into recovery. You can see in pink that all of these time words now are becoming these like salient features of the model, when we all can see that like time words in this case actually cripple our ability to reason about the validity of the data set. I was only able to show you one of the contextual errors here, but we actually have some really interesting contextual errors that happen in the negative data set, where people talk about very severe and dangerous symptoms that would indicate a very severe eating disorder diagnosis, but they never said that they were diagnosed, and so no data set's ever going to put that person into the clinically specific diagnosed category. And so this is actually the outcome of our audit. If we return back to this like figure from earlier, that shaded area is kind of the data of what we think that we get when we have a model that can identify these disclosures. So what we think that we get is here, and this is the actual training data that we get. We actually get more in this green area, and I would argue that with the other sort of contextual errors, like this green area gets kind of muddy and blurry and really, really like blobby. The training data that we actually get is people who say that they have disclosures, but that we can't actually verify if they have a clinically relevant eating disorder at the time that they say that they do. And then what happens is that our AI inference actually kind of blows out into this area that we can't use it to reason about even the blue area anymore, but we certainly can't use that to reason about the purple area. And this is a really, really popular signal in our data set. It was used by like 20 or 25 papers, which like is a fifth of the corpus. It was highly regarded by people as being like this clinically relevant and valid way of looking at disorders. But the problem is now this work raises the question of, well, were they actually predicting back to the blue and purple circles? Or did what they predict made a really, really high quality predictor that's predicting this like kind of blobby area we can't actually reason about its effectiveness? So I've shown you some of the like empirical ways that we've proven people wrong about this work. I'm going to throw out sort of 4 solutions. We've been thinking on how to solve these problems. One is thinking about other ways to triangulate data sets. So I don't want to totally poo-poo like people who go online and like disclose the fact that they have an eating disorders. Like we believe them, right? They are it's like high quality information of trustworthiness about this information. But we know that it can't generalize back to the larger category of people with eating disorders. So now I'm trying to think about, well, how could we actually leverage the small, imprecise data sets to start triangulating across different kinds of information? So people who post on #eating-disorder or who are posting generally in that eating disorder community as a larger kind of like less representative, less precise sample. Maybe we can get a very small sample of clinical data, and maybe we can actually use this data in concert with each other to predict and make the green circle of inference closer to the larger sample. Now, the challenges of this are like really, really high because each of these problems here have their own representation and bias problems that have to be navigated when you start to incorporate them into a larger model. And in fact, the modality and quality of these data sets widely vary. And so you might not be able to seamlessly bring them into the same model unless you're positive that they come from the same time frame, from the same community, which hurts our ability in the field to use and leverage all the data sets that are popping up. The other thing that we've been thinking of is just getting better data sets. And so one of the challenges of our labeling process here was that there was sort of no context in the state-of-the-art practice for like identifying these temporal problems that we identify. And that's because ambiguity and contextual weirdness is to be expected when you have to use a proxy signal. And we also know that disagreement between people is normal. Mike Shakerman's work about medical experts disagreeing about diagnosis shows that people will actually, using the same clinical information, disagree about whether or not diagnosis should happen, and they're valid disagreements. And so one of the things we've been working on, this is Dan, one of my PhD students, is actually building a system behind the scenes that can collect better data for people doing work like this, that can facilitate labels from more representative perspectives, that might help us make better inferences about where those like Venn diagram circles should be and how their data like is actually composed. And I have a little screenshot of the like example of this that we're working on right now. This has to be an internal tool rather than kind of leveraging out of the box stuff, because the disagreement and the ambiguity labeling is just not something that like machine learning labels like handle right now. And so right now we've got like a little task of like, is this a blep or not, to test like the work. But our goal is to eventually have this be a place where like different kinds of expertise can come in and say, hey, maybe this isn't a diagnosis that I want to impose on here, or maybe there's temporal relevance that should put it in a second like position behind stuff that we have really, really high quality information about. The other idea that I've been noodling on is like generating synthetic data with LLMs. You could imagine just like firing like a really, really good prompt at ChatGPT and say, hey, can you generate me 1,000 examples of posts of people who are suffering from clinically specific examples, symptoms of depression. You could also imagine strategically tuning this on our data set or other data sets. I have mixed feelings about this. Part of it is because ChatGPT is a black box that I can't go in and inspect how it's working to verify that like kind of psychological validity itch that I get. But it does have this interesting like appeal of like quickly scaling up data sets for hard problems. And ChatGPT and other like large language models use gigantic corpora that I can't myself gather very, very quickly. And so there's this like trade-off of using like synthetic data, not only in my context of mental health, but how you might use synthetic data generation techniques in other areas where you have small data sets but have urgent need to sort of scale them out. And then the last one, which is sort of like spicy, I'm just mad about this, is like, why do we always have to predict diagnosis, right? Like maybe we should just change the prediction target. Diagnosis is a kind of like myopic and limited target variable. As I mentioned earlier, like people who are coming to r/depression and our eating disorder, they're sad. They're distressed, right? We have other behavioral markers that might actually matter for an intervention that have nothing to do with whether or not they meet a clinically specific diagnosis of an eating disorder. If they say they're engaging in binging and purging behaviors, why do we need to diagnose them to give them advice and behavioral interventions to help them? And this has been treated as the golden goose for this area in this way that I find very frustrating, given the diversity of tasks that you might leverage AI in this space for, but also the kind of policy and interventions AI systems and their decisions lead to, such as content moderation and intervention. And so this is a model from another paper that I was working on where I was trying to kind of mess with this idea of latent variables for suicide crisis using Reddit data. And you can imagine like multitask setups towards inferred behaviors that might actually better inform the kind of intervention that you might take. And these multitask setups might actually help you use one model with a high quality data set towards inferring different kind of policy outcomes. For example, you could imagine a model that predicts very, very dangerous or risky behaviors and recommends removal of some content, while other kinds of cognitions or behaviors may not be nearly so urgent, and you might de-escalate the kind of like target outcomes that might be from that model. All right. I've got a little bit more left. I'm going to take a quick water break. Are there any clarification questions? All right. So I spent a lot of time talking about this kind of like conceptual, analytical, empirically showing that I was actually right all along work, and then kind of this like brainstorming about technical ways to solve these problems. But I want to think a little bit about how you might actually use AI systems to intervene when people are being distressed. I've kind of speculated about this a bit, but I've actually gotten really interested in doing this in context. And the context that's most interesting to me right now is on TikTok. Embarrassing question, how many of y'all use TikTok or Instagram Reels? Okay, this is actually way higher than the last time I asked this question at Macalester College.
Why is this embarrassing to ask that?
Okay, some people find using TikTok to be embarrassing. And they like don't want to admit that they use TikTok. I don't understand it personally because like, I use a platform. Like you might use it completely differently than me, but I had 3 people who admitted it at Macalester College. And when I was like, and how many of you are embarrassed and didn't tell me that? Like several of them shot their hands up. But TikTok, short form video recommendation engine, gives you 1 video at a time, right? And you have no control over that recommendation system. And so we actually were curious about why people were using TikTok to study what kind of mental health information was being pushed through it, as well as how the curation of the FYP, which is that recommender system, actually affected their well-being. And so we interviewed 16 participants at a Chi paper that we published last year, or I guess this year, it's still 2023. What is time post-pandemic? And we've also got a follow-up study about how people leverage multiple social media platforms to find information about their mental health that's currently under review. But what we found is you might not actually be surprised that TikTok provides like wonderful benefits to people that delight and inspire them, but also harms their mental health for many people who use the platform that have mental illnesses. So on the side of benefit, people love the fact that TikTok was organic and serendipitous and gave them recommendations that helped them see like into themselves, but also see, respect, and like understand other people's experiences more empathetically. And they loved when TikTok actually gave them information that they could take to their doctor and say, hey, this TikTok video explained time blindness to me in a way that I didn't know that I understood. I feel like I have time blindness. Can I talk about this with my therapist? And use it as kind of a springboard to help them understand themselves. But the double-edged sword problem is that people talked about TikTok as this runaway train of information that they have no control over. One of our participants says that I think a lot of the algorithms run on chaos. So it runs on what emotion it can elicit from the user. And so people talked about how if they were dealing with traumatic experiences, TikTok would just keep giving them more and more and more people talking about their trauma. And for people with PTSD or who have triggers from trauma, that the FYP actually would trigger them and upset them. And their option was either to stop using TikTok or to like keep scrolling and playing roulette, hoping that they wouldn't see another video and they'd actually get something more comforting about cats or food or whatever. And so we've been working with participants now in workshops to actually design what an intervention might look like to stop those harmful effects that I just mentioned, while also preserving some of those benefits that people find from using TikTok. And we've been trying to figure out ways to stop what we've dubbed this runaway train. The challenges of this is actually pretty hard, though, because people are very, very defensive in a good way about the benefits that TikTok might provide. This is like some of the things that have come up is like identifying moments for interventions. Do you like want to say every 25 minutes you should stop using TikTok to like refresh and like make your brain happier? Or do you want to do this in a contextual way? How do you test this on a real system when TikTok's really restrictive about its API usage? Should we intervene in problematic social media use patterns? Some of our participants were like, leave me alone. I don't want you to intervene. I just want to scroll. And thought that an intervention in this case was paternalistic. And so built on some of these ideas, we sort of have 2 kind of models that we're using. The top one is the idea of a tab. Where you give people the ability to control the recommendations that happen within a given part of TikTok. So you would have like 2 FYPs, and one which you could specify, please don't put mental health content in this. I just want this to be cats and cooking and like gardening videos. And another tab that you might actually engage in with mental health. And people really liked this idea because it gave them the control to like both isolate this information from each other, but to also interact with it when they were feeling like they wanted different kinds of content. The other idea that a participant floated to us was a choose your own adventure novel. So when like a context-laden system detects that you may be down a rabbit hole about content that might trigger you, it says, hey, what's up? You sure you want to keep doing this? Could we have some kind of button that says, deletes the last 24 hours of my interaction history, so TikTok actually reverts its algorithm back before you got down the rabbit hole in the first place? Do you want to have a timed break? Do you want to have some choose your own adventure that says, I noticed that you've been looking at content that has a lot of hashtags about mental health. Do you want to swap over to a different side of TikTok and have more serendipitous interactions on not serious topics? And these are 2 ideas from our participants. One of the challenges we've been running into, though, is like companies are making it really, really hard for us to access and do these kind of tests. TikTok, we do have research API access in my group, but the research API, if you've never used the TikTok API before, it stinks. It's really slow and you can't intervene in the FYP at all. And they don't even let you pull the FYP directly for a given person. And then other platforms that I've historically done work on, which is Reddit, they like clobbered their API access over the summer. And on the right is like Twitter/X, who is now trying to charge me $5,000 a month to be able to gather 1 million posts. Which is a very, very slow rate for a researcher who may have multiple students wanting to do different projects and makes doing the kind of work that I do really, really hard. And so we run into these challenges and we're trying to actively navigate how we operate in good situations like this. Now, given that I'm a little over time, I'm actually going to go ahead and just skip my outro. But what I do want to talk about is some of these open questions that remain about ethics and about technical challenges and about the outcomes of what the kind of world we want to see when we build these systems. And some of the questions that I've been thinking about a lot are like, what are the requirements that we actually have to meet when we make a performance system? Like, do we actually need the performance of it to be the accuracy to be 95% if all predictions are going to be run through people? I don't know. And who should we bring into this process to make sure that we actually have good answers for these kinds of challenges that we've been running into? Are doctors the appropriate ones to bring in when the intervention may not actually have to have anything to do with a clinician at all? What are policy solutions to protect people? And then I think there's this open question about that my participant brought up. Should we even design these kind of interventions at all? Or am I just being a patronizing researcher who thinks they know what's best for people? With that, I'd like to open us up for some questions. Thanks so much for listening. Love to talk to you about this. Thanks.
All right, we got some time.
Quick question. Going back to a point that you made earlier already around should we actually be looking at diagnoses? I'm sure you've come across the newer works where researchers take data, behavioral data and MRI imaging, and come up with a completely new mapping of symptoms and diagnoses that hasn't grown the way our current diagnosis system has grown organically over a lot of time. And I was wondering how maybe you can use these newer mappings of symptoms towards new clusters of diagnoses or clusters of symptoms to inform your work and how you gather data.
No, that's a really, really good question. I was actually thinking about I think it's almost like a multimodal exploration of how symptoms can manifest both cognitively, behaviorally, physically, as well as like neurologically. One of the problems that we just have to deal with in mental health compared to other areas is mental health diagnosis is like 150, 200 years behind diagnosis of things like diabetes and cancer. And the diagnosis of mental illness for a really long time was fraught with like social outcomes and ramifications that you would be institutionalized, taken away from your family, or inhumanely treated. And we're only getting to the point where like homosexuality is not considered a mental illness. That was like literally in the last 40 or 50 years. So I think that there's a lot of innovation that's really, really great in this space, and mental health is just behind. It's behind in terms of like the ability to have this like multi-dimensional representation of what the concept is, as well as to know when the diagnostic concept is even valuable to leverage. Like, I don't know if I inherently care about diagnosis as the sort of like golden outcome when we're trying to predict if somebody may be talking about content that threatens other people's lives because they like provides advice or methods or other things that are very, very dangerous. And part of my goal is to just actually move away from diagnosis as the only thing that we care about. Could we have behavioral signals? Could we have cognitive things that people talk about? To your point about multimodality, what other ways could we enrich the data that we have about people's well-being to solve these problems? And it's something I am interested in and am cautiously optimistic might work. Cautious, it like depends on my mood. I'd say 55-45 right now.
My understanding about the problems that you started, about the problems with the models that you started to talk with, is that the data sets that they operate with are muddy, right? Because they incorporate signals about people who have been diagnosed and not, and so, right? So they result in mispredictions that my impression is are false positives.
For the specific one I gave you, it is a false positive.
Yeah, more so than false negative. So, and one has your thoughts about perhaps it's better if we are more forgiving of false positives as long as the recall is coming.
So your idea is to not put people who wouldn't be diagnosed into a bucket that would be diagnosed. I think that depending on the use of the system, that's true, but I can think of a lot of examples where the intervention or a lack of intervention might have social or legal ramifications. So if you imagine a system that might predict high-risk behaviors, and we have somebody who's actually engaging in high-risk behaviors, but is not classified by the system, and there's an intervention that somebody is socially responsible for, such as Facebook or Twitter or a research team that's helping, that is a bad outcome for the system because you're not actually delivering care to the person that needs it. However, in systems like the ones that we envision, false positive rates are like, your idea of like maximizing for false negative rates may actually be more valuable because you just have a much more generous screen-in process. The challenge with more generous screen-in is the labor that's required to execute those effectively and empathetically and in a way that's personalized to people. And so one of the downsides of like maximizing that in content moderation prediction specifically is like you just don't want to give like content moderators like double or triple the amount of work because your system is kind of loosey-goosely thinking about the concept. You increase somebody's workload. And so I think that depending on the outcome, this is why I was trying to tease apart the idea of the prediction and the policy outcome that's applied based on the prediction. You change your prediction target and the kind of metrics you might optimize for depending on the policy that you use. And so you're right, there are times where you would want to like change that.
All right, I'll jump in. So starting with things like your thigh gap paper, you start to articulate that kind of paternalism that can happen when the platforms try to start to take action here can either get pushed back on or can feel like it's sort of being spied on. Likewise, if you had some magic device that you just kind of sort of go beep and like see mental health diagnoses of anyone and you just pointed at them, like that also feels like a kind of autonomy, right? So I'm curious in particular, since the platforms like on the other side would get attacked if they did nothing, right? Like
Exactly.
They could have stepped up, but they didn't, or whatever. So I'm curious, does the medical literature or the field have any notions that are portable or translational here around, when they will contravene people's autonomy? When like, are there things? How would you advocate that the platforms or the technologists who are building these things ought to walk this line? Do we wait for people to come to us? Do we try to do this detection? If so, do we like say, hey, friend, is there an issue? Do you like? What do you actually? Yeah, if you were designing the product, what would you do?
That's a super good question, especially because my mood changes depending on what we're doing and how it's going to be leveraged and the social outcome that might be imposed on a person when that outcome happens. Now, the medical literature typically believes that it is appropriate to intervene and violate your autonomy when you are a threat to yourself or to others. People in suicide crisis forms often talk about being 5150'd, which is being involuntarily committed to a psych ward for 72 hours to make sure that you are safe to yourself. In those cases, it's pretty clear cut that the threat to yourself or to others is enough to overcome the value of autonomy that has been advocated time and time again for inpatient centered care, which is the current model that we use in the medical system, or at least are moving towards a model of patient-centered care. There are other circumstances, though, where medical professionals believe it's important to intervene, but may sort of navigate around issues of autonomy. So I mentioned specifically a threat to yourself or others. There's certain things that people may disclose, like child abuse or other sort of abusive patterns that trigger mandatory reporting requirements. The challenge is that the medical folks I've talked to want these kind of systems because they don't have enough money to provide the social support and personalized care for every individual. And so the question is, well, can you provide a larger group of people a slightly more elevated experience of care to give them some basic resources, rather than being able to have the resources necessary to give everybody comprehensive care? In my ideal world, we would have way more money and way more providers and way more psychiatrists, so we don't have month-long waits. And so in my head, I have to trade off the autonomy versus intervention argument that I mentioned before, but also this idea that the medical system cannot handle all of this right now in any country, to be very clear. And so my personal stance on this, which I'll just mention is a personal stance, this is not a clear-cut decision is that by providing different and escalating levels of interventions to people, such as not a nudge, because nudges, psychology is debating whether or not they actually work right now or not, but like different kinds of interventions, such as the choose your own adventure or giving people tabs, may allow people to actively and proactively manage their own well-being. Same thing with like lightweight therapy bots that may give people like cognitive behavioral or like DBT-based like interventions that might actually make their lives better until they can get into the therapist. And so the social responsibility of that towards question about like, well, what happens if you're wrong? Who is responsible when the AI system is wrong? What severity of wrongness does that entail? Like in the case of like somebody streaming a suicide video on Facebook, like this does happen. Like getting that wrong's really, really bad because it encourages other people to harm themselves. And you probably want to take action quickly and swiftly on those versus like lower grade, just call it like markers of distress. You may actually have like lower thresholds of policies for like low key interventions, but that people can like more easily like sort of swipe away. Yeah.
So digging in a little bit more to that in kind of a specific case, I'm curious if you think that having interventions that become known about may change how much people are able to seek social support online. So especially thinking if there are ever, like detected suicidal ideation leads to involuntary institutionalization, and thus this outlet that people previously thought was kind of safe from this mandatory reporting no longer is, and people don't seek the support that they like maybe don't even go to their therapist for because that space is no longer safe as well.
No, that's actually a really, really challenging point because Facebook has these models that work behind the scenes, and they also give people the rights in groups to ignore the platform-specific rules so that people can like modulate some of these rules so that they're not enforced on the group itself. So I don't typically like compliment Facebook on decent policies, but like that one was actually pretty good to give people space to talk about these kinds of things. I also think about the like opposite kind of version of this where people may overly rely on these interventions instead of actually seeking out more comprehensive care. And I don't think that that's like a big spooky boogeyman that the media is kind of making it out to be right now, like, oh, like AI is going to replace your therapist. Like, no. No, it's not. It like is not nearly as good as my therapist or many other therapists who have years of training. But I like to think about this in terms of the like, what kind of infrastructure do we need to maintain this space as safe if we are not going to leverage these technologies to make them more safe? So there is a website that I'm not going to tell you the name of. It is a very pro-suicide website. And they're the ones that recommendation was making the Amazon click-to-buy thing. It was from that website specifically that they propagated that. They don't have aggressive content moderation. They are very adamant about free speech, and the stuff that they share on that website is incredibly dangerous. And like, I do not want to tell you about it because like it's very bad. And in some cases, I think that the AI systems in those cases may actually support like a better dialogue so that it may like blur out or remove some of the most dangerous stuff without preventing people from sharing their thoughts and feelings, which that expression of it is really, really valuable. There are other sort of more contained spaces that I think are good models for reasoning about this. r/Suicide Watch is a suicide crisis support forum. They have very aggressive moderation policies about mentioning things that may trigger other people to commit suicide, specifically like methods, means, and plans. But they do an amazing job at giving people the space to talk through their suicidal ideation in a much lower judgment space. And in those cases, you might design an AI system that just really goes after those very, very damaging ones and then let human moderators manage the rest. And so I don't think AI is sort of this like silver bullet for solving the complexity of nor the nuance of mental health situations, nor making it a safe space for people to be able to continue to talk.
All right, I'm going to pause it here, but there will be some time to ask questions afterwards as well.
Sure.
Thank our speaker.